So I'd like to ask you if you could read it towards the end of the class, okay? To get a certain discussion on. Okay. All right, give it a second for people to show up. I do. I'm collecting papers. If you can either bring me the hard copy, or the alternative is the mailbox downstairs in the secretary's area, or if you send it to me by email, I'll simply send it to her to print out like that. Okay, it just gets complicated with my own printer, so we'll go like that. The other thing is I would eventually return books, so if you're planning to buy books, buy them. That includes, the Gadamer, the Recur, any of the books of mine that you are going to want to purchase, and so on. All right. So,
that article of yours on ethics of...
the one on ethics, did I put it on reserve? Did I put that on CHOP? Was that put on CHOP?
It was not put on CHOP.
I think it's just on Google if you just...
If you go to you can get it, it's published in Journal Religion about 2 years ago. There was a special edition of Journal Religion that dealt with sacred attunement, but it was the essay on the ethics of sacred attunement. So you can get it through...
It was available there.
You can get it that way, but I'll see if I can get it on...
But you can pick it up that way, and it's totally available.
You can get it like that, or through
Yeah.
Journal of Religion
On the
materials. Is there anything else that people are having trouble?
I have a copy if you want.
I want to go.
Okay.
I'll send it to you.
Okay. So what I want to do today is to the next phase of our study. I wanted to first review with you, or indicate to you, why I've started with the book of Job, or what the impact of that as a prologue towards the rethinking of a modern Jewish theology, by which I could really mean my own thinking about this material, and why I've used that both as a larger theological prompt for the course, but a more specific theological prompt for my own work. That will lead me, after the first opening remarks, to some initial comments about sacred attunement, bringing us about halfway into it. I want to kind of describe some things in a slightly different way than I have put it there, but not move yet towards some of my newer thinking, which I want to put off, and then I want to open up with certain questions that you may have with respect to some topics that you either have a pushback on, or on the basis of your personal or position, or reject, or want to qualify. That would be, I think, helpful not only to me but to everybody else to see whether parts of this work in a more general way. Although the first part is presented in a much more universal way, the second part moves towards a specific Jewish language. I must say that one of my dissatisfactions was that among the stronger appreciative responses often came from Catholic monks They call me Abba Michael. The reason it's particularly satisfying is that they're able to look past the specific language that makes it Jewish to what is become of spiritual significance overall, and then do the personal translation into personal terms. So I also want to be able to get a sense from you as we move forward where some of that can work for you from your Christian or non-Christian point of view, or if you have a different Jewish point of view, or if you have no perspective. I think a lot of that would be very helpful. Obviously, part of the hermeneutical task is to try to move from the more universal to a specific, and to keep those in a certain kind of correlation and a balance. And it requires a lot of translation, but whether that translation works, it depends not only on person's idiosyncrasies, but I think whether it strikes you as having coherence and truth at some level. So, as I indicated at one point in the Sacred Attunement, part of the task was not simply to write a private idiosyncratic statement. It had to work in a way that's beyond a personal voice. But it has to come out of a personal voice, but it has to work for community or for a much larger audience, or it's simply a diary entry. It's not public theology in any kind of sense. So that's a kind of, I'll come back to those issues, but that's part of what makes it so complicated in the modern period, where there's just so many vectors and so many considerations and so many ambiguities, and you try to write in a way that's responsive. So state in about, just to get this going in the first 15, 20 minutes, how Job may serve or serves me as a prologue to modern theology. Okay, and I'll just go through some of the key issues of that, and then maybe we'll pause at that point for a few minutes of reflection to see whether that actually works for you, or having come this far in the course, it makes any sense. Okay? So I want to begin by recapitulating things from a more phenomenological point of view to kind of resituate my own self, and I hope yourselves to some degree, into the book of Job. So the first thing to consider is that the book of Job begins in medias res. It begins in the middle of a human being's life. So you're always already engaged in some theological or traditional project. Part of the issue is whether do things happen that turn you around, or as I mentioned about Wittgenstein, can you get turned around? Just to be turned around, but can theology help you stay turned around once you've been turned around? Right? So that's part of the issue. Can theology become a form of living that keeps that new insight stable or livable? Right? So you get turned around by certain crisis, and then you just suddenly close over and heal the Band-Aid and wound, go back to things after you have a week of mourning? Or do you actually integrate that into a new personal development? So theology begins always already in the life that you were living. You're doing something that gives your life coherence, meaning, and probably more than just a pragmatic level, but also at a level of theological or metaphysical significance. And part of that is to live a life that is ordered within, we saw, a kind of a sacred canopy, a sense of ritual that keeps one in a certain rhythm of time, with links to family, to harmony, to tradition, and so on. All of those are part of the prologue of the book. You begin with something that seems to work as long as it works, right? Or you kind of retread the tires and put a patch on here and there. But as long as it's working, it works. Okay? The next question is that something happens. There's a happening. Something that happens of a more or less incomprehensible nature. Incomprehensible in the sense that the mind doesn't quite immediately get its head around it. Or the first shock is not then to kind of regroup within the cognitive terms that you already had. For Job, it's disaster, it's crisis, it's death, it's destruction, it's loss. Everything that appears he had been working his life to kind of provide a spiritual defense against, right? As if you could live outside of time in some kind of a transcendent realm that, although you're living temporally with ritual, somehow that locks you into a trans-temporal dimension, and you can transcend the crisis. I refer to that as a rupture or as a caesura. In other words, something happened. Things simply open up. They could open up through the beauty of the natural world. They can open up through some remarkable experience of wondrous life, and also they open up by death. But something seems to break open the normal conceptual categories. That's what I mean by incomprehensible. We don't try to comprehend. There's a space where it's not comprehended, and it doesn't seem to have any particular cognitive aspect, and one is face to face with some kind of fullness which is empty, but it's going to have to be filled in somehow or closed off. So the rupture affects one's relationship to the natural world, the social world, and to the material and spiritual level. So all this is related to Job. In relationship to all that, still within the aspect of the prologue, where Job becomes important here is the initial and ongoing search for integrity. Right? When that happens, how do you move a life of integrity? Right? Do you bracket off your life and say that the tradition has more integrity than my life? That the categories I receive because they're known by other people for a longer period of time, they have a certain authority, so I submerge myself to that? Or does integrity mean I rely on my own interpretation of things based on my own personal experience? So that issue that will emerge, and of course for us as moderns, that raises all the complicated questions of subjectivity and the trust in subjectivity, the trust in one's own capacity to be honest with oneself, right? And I mean the Freudian rupture in the fullest sense, not in a Freudian sense only, but in the sense that there is a kind of break with a complete sense that you could trust your own thoughts about what you're doing. There's all kinds of deeper motivations. So what do you do? How do you remain what Job is, tamim, kind of to be yashar, to be upright, forward, to live a life that relates up to that? Now we saw that part of the move is immediately hermeneutical and liturgical, right? The liturgical expression of God gives, God has taken, or I came naked, that's already a hermeneutic that has been established by tradition, but which a person tries to put on or swallow and hope that you get rid of the headache, right? That you take a theological pill and you hope that it goes away. So that first move is very important. It's a kind of, you obviously want to lean back towards the tradition as it was, and that is a hermeneutical stance of integrity, right? And you try to conform yourself to that theological reality, which is not necessarily the world's reality of what just happened, but it's a kind of a meta-statement that you're trying to integrate that. Now, in relationship to that hermeneutical level, we see that Job gets us involved with the issue of reasons. What are the reasons to kind of reinforce your life position? Where do the reasons come from? Right? What is their justification? Still, this is all the issue of things that we all go through when we're trying to reappropriate our lives after it's been disappropriated in a certain sense by something that is totally off, not within this world. So that the prologue in heaven is that means things are going on of which we have no sense about, and it's to indicate that theology and the divine activity are really in totally different planes, and we're faced with that, but we're not. So then, part of that issue is, so what do you do with that? And we saw that Job, to some degree, is forced back to try to create an experiential hermeneutic and to try to explain things in terms of his own trust in his own integrity. And this is a kind of, not necessarily hubris, but there's an attempt to say, I only have myself. Part is the measure then by which you reevaluate things. Is your life or your integration or his own theological interpretation over against the friends a better measure than the friends, because he's saying it's happening to me and it's not just a universal issue. So there's traditional memories. And so part of that issue also, and I think it's crucial, is what is the role of pain and suffering have in this larger measure? There may be lots of things you can give up, but do things like loss and pain and suffering, are those sort of like the radical categories that push us to make a kind of re-evaluation of those issues? For Job as well, the hermeneutic is marked as well. The traditional hermeneutic doesn't work. I gave you some examples of how he plays with and reinterprets Psalm 8. What is man that you're mindful that you don't let him swallow his spittle, right? Or his inversion of Exodus attributes, where he turns the attributes of divine care into attributes of violence and disregard, right? So there's also the feature that the book of Job is putting in our face, that the old hermeneutics require a rethinking, and that one of the ways that you're rejecting the position is brought into crisis with the hermeneutic that also gives you a way of reformulating your position. Because you can't reformulate position in the abstract. It has to be over against the tradition that you're fighting with. So there's already a hermeneutic when you're involved in this problem of self-justification, right? So you're marking the tradition that was giving you stability as a way to give you new stability. Ironically, it's based on the tradition that gave you stability. But there's not that's part of the way out for Job, for us moderns, where there are multiple sources of truth and reality. It becomes much more complicated to try to find a solid standpoint for this kind of renegotiation. Related to Job and where I'm picking up on it and want to move is there comes at the end some form of revelatory disclosure, something that discloses the natural world in a different way than the first disclosure. The first disclosure was absolute horror. But it's as much a revelation, presumably, as the second one, right? They both become manifestations of divine power or creativity or force, however one wants to discuss it. One is done through the agency of the Satan, who allows these disasters to be manifest, but they are this reworking of the creation with the agency of God, at least within the fiction of the book, but that's the theological agency. And the revelation at the end is a different manifestation of divine agency that can be perceived through a different way of looking at nature, not totally as order, but as if. But that is going to break the mind open in a new way. Okay? So that breaks the mind open in a new way. And it does what I will talk about later, but I'll already hint at this point. It introduces both a new positioning in the cosmos and a new perspective. And I will not necessarily mean this in a Nietzschean perspectivism point of view, but certain moments create a new position and reorientation. So what the reorientation as a conversion or mental crisis moment is that from that new pivot position, everything is seen differently in relationship to it, right? It's a reorienting in the most fundamental cognitive sense. One of the questions that emerges through the book of Job that is crucial for me, and I think it has to be, well, as a way forward, is what is the ongoing relationship between that breakthrough in consciousness and the life that on an everyday basis? How do you hold those two levels of reality in mind? And we'll see as we move towards Jewish theology, at least how I make certain kinds of speculations about that. In other words, there is a truth that broke open that's independent of the categories or the structures of existence or the structures of action, where it's just a raw, radical experience. And then there are the immediate human hermeneutical implications of what do I do with that, and not simply as the new response, like that is a type of Sinai, but if there was truth to the first experience, can I keep it in relationship to all that I go through, and does that qualify the second? In other words, is the first so absolute that it qualifies the second? What is the relationship between this experience of divinity in an absolute sense and then living with divinity, both in a theological and what we might say a practical, ethical sense? So can you keep the two together? Obviously, I made the suggestion that Job has a kind of sympathy and regard for the diversity of creatures, but that is already a hermeneutical appropriation, where when he says, I despise myself and I'm dust and ashes, he realizes the limitation of human, even ethical or spiritual construction, because he's aware of these two massive orders. And the question is, from a theological point of view, what do you do? And then, as we'll move forward, how do you reform or formulate a new matrix? What is that new matrix? Right? And what would be the new matrix for a Job who had inherited the book of Deuteronomy or a scripture? Right? Right? Does that matrix remain, or does it have to be reinterpreted? In other words, is there something that took place that so reoriented the cognitive structure of mind that becomes a guiding hermeneutic towards the new life that one wants to build? So it becomes a way to establish a new, even a tradition. Okay? So related to that is, how does the self recover a new hermeneutic? And do that, and this is a crucial issue that we're going to have to face all along, and do that so that it's not simply private subjectivity, that it has a divine ground to it. Right? How do you recover a new hermeneutic that is affected and transforms subjectivity and doesn't fall, what we might say, is into the modern, I'm not saying trap, but to the modern predicament that now everything is only subjective and only from the ground up. So, is there anything left of a divine, objective presence or voice that's still a regulating factor? And I want to be able to talk about that through nature and culture and text and as we go forward. But that's part of the hard issue that we have. So we have a shift in consciousness. Let me just make a couple more points, then I see already people want to jump in. Where there is a perceived limit to reason. So to the new hermeneutic is based on a search for a new thoughtfulness and wisdom, but not for an absolute truth that the individual realizes is unattainable. So is there a way that one can re-achieve a wisdom and a thoughtfulness that remains in touch with those primary issues, but in a totally new way that keeps you honest from a modern point of view, and that remains divine, as we'll try to see in a certain way. So let me stop for a second. I have a couple more things, but I see a couple of... So Adrian, I think you already... If not, I'll go on. But I thought you were gesturing...
No, I was. The first point is that the Orthodox monks also had a very positive reaction to your book.
Yeah.
But then the second point is, as you were talking, what struck me is, how do you differentiate the, let's say, the soul or the solution or the way of Job from the way of Kohelet, which is for me there is a tension there. It's a different way of, I don't want us to divagate into the Kohelet, but Kohelet seems to me quite a different to look into.
Right. Well, I touch on it slightly towards the end of Sacred Attunement, and I'll talk about it a little bit more. I think the real difference is that Kohelet or Ecclesiastes is involved in a calculating mind. He's constantly trying to make calculations. He's trying to evaluate best solutions or best practices, best theological practices based on these kinds of issues of what he can see and experience, right? But he is constantly trapped, except for a few rare places, in a calculating mind. I think Job breaks out of a mind that's constantly calculating and making evaluations that way. In other words, the new mode of value is not evaluating. Evaluating is a different kind of ratio. And the ratio of Kohelet is constantly comparing. If there's anything that the revelation in Job is affecting us, is that you don't compare. The person and the mystery of the vulture are all part of a vast mystery. They're not compared to God, they're not compared to the self. The self is aware of it, but it's not making any judgment based on that, except there is a new consciousness that's formed out of it, right? So we have to evaluate Kohelet independent of the pious ending, right? Which then says, well, you just have to go back to the tradition and live within that, because within all the orders of spiritual cognitive possibility, that works in a spiritual way. But it's constantly turning around these issues. I think the closest, as long as we're just mentioning that, I think that the closest where Ecclesiastes comes close to Job is a radical notion of temporality, that everything, right? So there's this difference between Zman, everything has its Zman, everything has its temporality, and things have their own they have their own momentary way of appearing in time, right? And that becomes a certain kind of cognitive awareness that we may want to come back to. It doesn't have the anger that God has done everything in his own way, and he's put enough knowledge into a human being's mind to become aware that they can't solve problems, right? Et haolam natan b'libo. God has put awareness of the world into a person's mind, and that's just to drive you nuts. Now, there's enough to know that you have self-awareness, but you can't solve the problem, right? That's part of his powerful understanding. But in terms of this linking it to Job, I would say an acute consciousness of temporality, which Job doesn't get to. That the issue of seeing the diversity of creaturehood and nature is a way of seeing how things emerge in their own way. But it's a perception of things that are it's worldly in the natural sense, as opposed to a consciousness that I think one would have to integrate towards a new covenantal theology that I want to express much later in the course, where it's the attunement to different moments of temporality over against the larger rupture that, right? Because even those moments are hermeneutical moments of interpretation, right? You can't forget that. That's part of what that double aspect is saying, that you can't forget that even though I think that I'm making wonderful interpretations about this moment of the ostrich and this moment of this thing in time, I've still given a hermeneutic against something that transcends hermeneutics.
5 seconds. Another thing that thank you for this wonderful that maybe Kohelet and Job share is, I think, there are moments in Kohelet where you have the same decenteredness of where it's moving towards decentering the human being, which I think that's how I see the end of Job. A radical, like Job moved. this is not an economy which is about him. So you have to, at the end, he has to realize that this is something much greater, and he's not the center of the story. And I see that a little bit in Kohelet too. And this is, I think, a very important realization. That you are here, you're part of it, but don't take it personal. In a way, I mean, just to put it.
So let's put that into suspension. I don't want to. I touched on Kohelet, and maybe we'll come back to it a bit later, and maybe we'll come back to that radical issue. I think that the skeptical position is a different position than the Job position. I'm not saying that the two have to be totally divorced from one another, right? Perhaps the skeptical position has to constantly undermine any false new piety that one has now achieved the new right hermeneutic. Right? So we have to live in a much more complicated way, and I don't want to dodge that, but let's wait till we get there. There can be a destructive skepticism. And then the question is, how do you integrate limit and finitude so that you can still go you? So you can't throw that away. So a couple more points, and we'll turn towards sacred attunement, things like that. So there is this crisis of what's plausible. There's a crisis of plausibility. And to put it in more metaphorical terms, which I want to pick up on as a sustained metaphor, how do you read reality and how do you read the world? Because ultimately, I want to suggest a connection or a more profound correlation between the reading of the world and the reading of text have to be brought together. In other words, if you're in a culture which is not simply a natural world and trying to read the world, but you're in a world that for whom certain texts are foundational moments of wisdom, the same way the natural world is, what is the relationship between reading the world and reading the text? That's a fundamental link. And that's part of the move towards a new plausibility. If you don't make that move, you're living a dichotomous or schizophrenic. So I have all the problems of plausibility of reading the world, or making sure that things work, and then I have old-time religion, right? And I just say that works on a different scale, and I'm not going to relate the two, right? So in a certain sense, so that turns theology into a kind of default position. I have all these other things, and I read Scripture totally differently. I want to try to relate these levels of plausibility. Without doing that, I think that you're constantly in this spiritual crisis. I'm not saying that there's a final truth to the matter, but it's part of what is the task, is to live with some kind of integrity, that there are no gaps. The way that I read the world has some measure of truthful relation to the way I will read texts. The way I read text will help me read the world better. That's part of what the spiritual exercise of reading to those 4 levels of sacred attunement is, to kind of make you aware, to be attentive to the world in a different way. Stephen?
To retain Scripture at all with the new consciousness, isn't it possible to say, this new consciousness means to me that irrespective of the Scripture, I will make my own evaluation of the divine aspect of the world and not rely on Scripture?
Lots of people do. Some people can't. So I'm speaking for the position that you can't let go of an inherited truth of tradition, and that you're not going to be so brazen as to say it has no wisdom. The question is, what is its new wisdom? Of course you could step out of the game. And that is both the temptation and the truth of modernity, right? There are a million reasons to step out of the game. And then part of that issue is, which game do you choose? Or how do you keep the composite as something true? And part of the task is, can you have multiple perspectives and still keep the tradition as a guiding or centering framework? You have to live somehow, right? Or else you just live in a fragment. So turn to a form of religious or spiritual coherence or cohesion without forgetting all the stuff that you just learned. So maybe truth is transformed into wisdom, but at least you're shifting the ground. Obviously you could do that, and then you have the problem of choosing what we call a lifestyle, right? But a lifestyle is not trying to live within the framework of the larger notion of cosmic destiny, right? And so part of that is is accepting or rejecting the tradition. And part of the reason that I will want to begin from nature, move up to the scripture, is that the notion of the hermeneutical transformation has been going on for thousands of years. So there's no reason not to continue that. I mean, the problem of, we'll have to come back to this, but the problem of modernity has, on the one hand, made everything seem so relative that it has no coherence, and on the other hand, the problem of modernity has made people who are capable of need and stiff, because modernity, the alternative, seems to be such an open abyss that you close around tradition as a kind of bulwark. So, but traditionally, there was a deeper hermeneutical flexibility. Modernity has allowed Jews and Christians and Muslims to forget that and to close around fixed positions, mostly as a modern response to the crisis of modernity, right? Those positions are modern positions. They're not positions when people were self-confident. I'm not saying it's an absolute across the board. Obviously, some people have the cognitive and spiritual capacity to live with ambiguity or with hermeneutical daring. So part of that issue is the performance that's done with the community, and then the mental hermeneutical difference that can be done. That's not simply the old notion of orthodoxy versus orthopraxy, that you have fixed belief and fixed practice, but there are all right, we'll come back to these issues. But you're right, you can get out of the game, or you can take a Nietzschean position and you simply say, well, it's just which hermeneutical game is stronger, right? That gives you more power, which is the stronger hermeneutic, right? But we're not moving that way. We're trying to construct a life of value, not just the power. So there's a much more integrated issue that we have to go through. So there's the plausibility of a hermeneutic that integrates the natural world, that integrates something of what we can say honestly about the philosophical world, and that doesn't forget the critique of modernity, right? That doesn't forget the fact that we now have created a new metaphysical horizon that we can't break through. The question is, does the divine still break through nevertheless? So that's the first issue, the crisis of plausibility, and to create a hermeneutic that's integrating the natural, the spiritual, and the world of tradition as well, and philosophy. I'm going to try to suggest that philosophical theology is a necessary step because it's part of the form of reasoning and justification. That's not as such, but it's a form of the way that we have to think about things and make sense. Then there's the crisis of a living theological orientation. So it's not just getting your head around the plausibility, but how do you live with it? How do you put that into practice, right? What would be the new type of language, the new way that you name or refer to God, the new way that you understand the commandments, the new way that you would understand creation, revelation, and redemption, which we're going to move towards the end, right? That would not, that would live within a tension between reading the world and reading Scripture as well. No simple way around that. And part of that risk from the very beginning, or if we have any limited faith in, it's that tradition could allow that to happen, right? If you don't have a prior faith, a tradition, to happen out of the game, right? If you say, no, there's a limit to interpretation, no, there's a limit to what the tradition is saying, in an open-minded way, right? I mean, there's obviously when all of us at different points in our life pushed back against our birth traditions, you make a harder position. No, it can't go that way, so I have to draw a very hard line to go into a different framework. But then the question is, can you come back to this in a different way? Or is that first position either the only true one or the only true one for you as well? I'm not legislating one way or the other. I think that the third, but you have to recognize there's a difference between first pushbacks and then the question is whether what you have to do for your own integrity and then what you do at another level. Right? We all have gone through that, I'm sure. So then the third issue that I just want to bring up is, since we're talking about the human being has to do this interpreting, and the human being is doing all of this, and the other reason why the book of Job is so essential in this project, is there is an absolute crisis for many moderns, but it's not something of the trust in a human being in the context of radical evil. It's much harder to talk about being created in the image of God unless God is also related to all of this. And we're going to have to think about that. Right? In what sense does this make sense? So in other words, certainly for us as moderns, the issue of a century of wars with hundreds of millions of people dead through the agency of the insanity of human beings puts a kind of qualification around, or maybe it's the reason why you have to turn towards a certain spiritual delicacy about how do you go forward. Not the old way, but something to retrieve what human value can be. Right? And we were talking last time, we talked about the difficulty of Herman Cohen's position that there's a kind of truth suffering. I said it was obscene, and there was a person in the back of the room who comes from a much more traditional fundamentalist background, and he said it was obscene, and he made a face, and he hasn't shown up today. So I think that the question is how much you're willing to face some of that.
second. Herman Cohen's
He
words.
was saying about that this is part of a divine providential plan to make you aware that suffering can be integrated to a deeper sympathy, but that's giving a positive evaluation. And then driving home, you hear about the Taliban hacking people to death in Pakistan, then you have the stuff in Ecuador, and you have all the stuff that's going on with the migrants. You say, what's going on, right? I mean, we're talking about human beings. So when we're trying to reconstruct this, the issue of evil as a primitive core of this can't be dismissed, and how one reconstructs an honest religious life today, I'm sure with solutions perhaps, right? Or you get different fallback positions. I don't think it's I think there's just it's too complicated, and it's too much in our face how brutal humans are, and how brutally religion can be used as a justification. So it's not that all the other things are not possible, but I don't think that has to be taken into fundamental account in a new hermeneutic of whether religious life is plausible, right? And I don't say that to put everything on the same scale so that certain microaggressions against certain people or things like that are on the same scale of these massive things. I think what they call now intersectionality is some kind of a term that's used, where once you say that there's a problem in one area, then you have to see everything across the board as on the same scale. But I'm saying that there's a lot that we can't put our heads in the sand about. And to move forward, Job becomes important. It's not only of the fear of coming to a new rational or theological position, but it has to integrate a new awareness of what a human being is, and that would have to affect what sacred attunement is. How do you deal with all the things and make spiritual decisions, right? So I want to see, did you have a thing?
I had a question with regard to the interpretation of Job. To what extent? I mean, it's kind of going camps. I don't know.
Maybe let's,
Yeah.
okay. I want to move forward a little bit more. Anybody else want to come in on the things that we were talking about? Yes?
Yeah, maybe I'll get to this when we start talking more about sacred attunement, but when we were first talking about the kind of scissoral moments that cause ruptures in thinking in theology, you referred to as some kind of like experience of nature or kind of existential wonder that can cause that. So do you mean to say that like these kind of theological reinterpretations can be caused by positive experiences, where it doesn't have to be death and destruction?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
In other words, it's, I'll speak a little bit more about that, but what I'm trying to locate, we call an event. It has some kind of qualified experiential aspect, but it's not an event that immediately communicates meaning, right? Or it's not, in the most radical Schleiermachian sense, a religious moment, that noumenal moment is a religious moment. I say that's already an interpretation of it, right? So the issue is, are there moments that shatter the frame, and then they create a new form of consciousness, of awareness, that you're now reinterpreting your way back into a world, right? And then the question is, does that have a truth that is a regulating truth? So for me to live at this double level of consciousness means that that moment is probably more primary as a regulating theological insight, but it would also regulate the humility of what you do on an ongoing basis. Right? It doesn't mean that what the love and the practice that you do interpersonally loses its, but is placed in a scheme of a regulating principle, right? So yes, it can be the shock of the wonder of nature, or it can be being present at the birth of a child or at a death. But in all of these cases, that is out of time in a certain sense, right? And it becomes a regulating principle of insight that the human being can have. I mean, I will try to suggest that it has a certain revelatory quality, perhaps in the sense that Christians speak of special revelation, type of intuition. But it still is at a different order than the normal cognitive categories. So that issue of the nature of that, is it a special revelation, which is a kind of a qualified issue of intuition, awareness, inspiration. All right, I'm going to come back to that as well in terms of what I would want to try to talk about is the voice, the divine voice that speaks to all these different things in different ways. Okay, but that's already requires a commitment. So that in the end, and now this is the transition to the beginning until we go forward, is the beginning realization that one must begin with an ontology of the natural world. Right? Right? Not with ideas and thoughts, not with what people now say the abstract, but you have to begin with the concrete. Right? And you have to build up again, that's the new thing. Can you rebuild from the concrete natural world something of the nature of experience that then can retally with the truth of the tradition or help modify it and so on? That's where I want to begin going. So we start with the natural world. And that natural world is a world of primary, is a primary search for physical permanence. We have to eat, right? There is an urge at the most primary level to find value points, ontological level, that allow us to exist, right? And we make both unconscious and conscious hermeneutical choices all the way up and down the natural spectrum of which kinds of things will allow me to sustain my life. For myself, I deprive another person because I eat it and they don't eat it, but I'm making choices because I want to exist, I don't want to be sick, I don't want my family to be sick, right? I have spheres of self-interest, right? And it begins with the self-interest that Job also had of the survival of his body and his family and a sustainable world. And that involves positives and negatives that are both intuitively and cognitively seen, right? I'm saying these terms very specifically, but these are kind of pluses and minuses of to do and not to do that are deeply embedded in the structure of existence, right? Now, let's leave aside any kind of divine voice in relation to that. But the first level there are different levels of hermeneutical choice, of motility and mobility. I take this because it is desiring to the eyes. I take this because it'll give me more knowledge. I take this because I want to incorporate that. I want to live, right? So there is this issue all the way up and down the organic chain, but it's at the ontological level of organicity and choice. Now, at the first level, in which one becomes what we would call there's an increase of self-consciousness of being a person. Part of that is also this awareness of the need for gratification at all these other levels. Gratification of food, gratification of health, right? And it goes together with a very primary aspect that Santayana spoke of as animal faith. Okay? That this animal faith is primary, which is to say that philosophy and theology, I have the faith that this world is sustainable. Right? In other words, it's a pre-reflective notion that I'm not even at a first level conscious of. That I'm in a creation, or let's say I'm in a world, and I have an instinctive confidence that I can continue. Right? We're going to see that there's a scale of movement. But I begin at the level of instinctive confidence that this world is my world. It's an animal. In other words, it's a kind of pre-thematic faith that one has of simply being in the world. We don't. Without that, the sense, and it's communicated by every kind of reconfirmation that the world is sustaining me, right? So this is, so that the first evidence for faith is simply the existence of the world. That's the evidence. The evidence I have is the things in the world that I have to move around in and make my choices in. And to a certain degree, early cognitive and reflective. At the moment that it becomes reflective, I am on the path of philosophical understanding, a form of transcendence. In other words, I have beginning to bring reason and thought to bear on a reflection on the world that I'm existing in. That my self-consciousness is able to think about orders of significance. And as I would proceed along that natural path, the moments of new openings of transcendence give me larger and larger sense of cohesion, integration. I have a sense of how things are working. And I'm trying to create forms of hermeneutical coherence and integration. But this is where I was already saying that we have to factor in this notion of rupture and caesura, right? These breaks in the food chain, breaks in food, breaks in all kinds to be reintegrated into this so-called philosophical reflection, right? And now I'm gradually, still within the natural order of philosophy, moving beyond that level of instinctive plus minus, yes, no, at a precognitive faith level, to my belief that I should do this and not that, right? There is a thing to do this that's embedded in that creative order That this says you shall do this, and this says you shall not do this, right? And it's a perception that grows by individuals, and it grows as well by tradition, right? You already get that from your parents. Don't go near the stove, right? Or don't go near the tree, or don't go outside and touch the bush when there are bees around, or things like that. But these are traditional notions of you shall do this and you shall not do that, right? And they from the instinct to a reflective normativity that is passed down through tradition, right? It may already be embedded in what we would call religious orders of language, but I'm trying to keep that separate. It's still at this kind of level of reflection on value, reflection on what I believe will succeed, what tradition has helped me believe will succeed. It doesn't necessarily mean at the first level that I've transcended self-interest. What I believe will succeed may be the benefit for me personally, and so it's still self-centered, or the things that I believe will help me succeed for my family, right? So to a certain degree, we're involved, at least insofar as we're on this Jobin curve of moving towards the possibility of not being self-centered or self-referential, right? As we move along this larger thing towards a much larger notion of integration, where it's not all about that kind of across, but we're still at this level. So at this first level, there is this ongoing level of what we would call philosophical reflection, which always continues because you're always trying to get a handle on a comprehensive sense of things, and you're aware, you're trying to move towards the absolute outer limit of what Jaspers spoke of as the encompassing. How far can you go to that outer limit where you begin to take in as much as you can mentally take in? Okay? I think in this, and the norms of you shall do this and you shall do that are emerging within that, within different orders of self-reflective personal centrality, or now the group is more central, now the nation is more central, now the world is more central, now I'm making all kinds of balances, but I'm making value choices of doing this or that based on a whole series of considerations. The theological, and also to sacred attunement, this is this moving towards theology, okay? Are these ruptures that then become a regulative notion for reflection, right? They don't have philosophical cognitive issue, otherwise you move back down to the rationality that you were at. But these open, and I'm still not yet talking about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I'm trying to talk still at a kind of
Pre-scripture.
But it's pre-scripture. But I don't want to talk about. It's not. Maybe it's getting closer to philosophical theology, but it's not. It's this breakthrough of awareness that there is a dimension that is other than the outer limits of philosophical reflection. And the only way that I think we could just most abstract religious terms that help us still at this point, I think are two. One is that awareness produces or elicits the raw moment, because I don't want to talk about it as experience. It's that raw moment of what we call in religious terms yirah in Hebrew, or reverence. In other words, it's within the framework of the human spirit and the mind, it's the first fundamental sense, not just that of transcending consciousness and rationality, but a sense of the most radical sense of transcendent otherness that produces this radical sense that we call in common language the difference between infinitude and finitude, right? There is the sense of reverence produces this notion of some more radical, call it absolute, call it illimitable notion of infinitude and the finitude of the self in relationship to it, right? That's already very quickly a hermeneutic, right? But the raw moment happens. And the raw moment that the world is filled with bounty is related to it, right? In other words, I think I want to kind of build in two Jewish or biblical terms, but using those terms, but I don't think at this first level, and we don't have any other language for it, so at least understand that I'm trying to use terms that come down to the tradition, but they're at the limit of language. So one is what the Hebrew speaks of yirah, or the Hasidic tradition talks about yirah gedolah or yirat haromemut, the exalted sense of reverence, where there's something that just keeps exceeding, right? What we talk about in terms of height, right? We talk about that as height, right? And that becomes a metaphor for that sense. And then the sense of radical finitude, right? So that there is this primary sense of what we call awe, or this awareness, which is different than a philosophical consciousness. Awareness of the world as filled with all kinds of mysterious bounty that comes with that. Okay? So, in a way that I think happens in a spontaneous consciousness, before it's explicated hermeneutically, is something that we all forget. And that is that primordially, or for heightened religious consciousness, this notion of transcendence and imminence are not separate. They're both together, right? There is this sense that there is this huge space, but that space fills the raw world in which the self has fallen as a finite creature, right? And the imminence of bounty, which is the second term, I'll kind of elaborate this as the Hebrew word chesed, which simply means the grace of unfolding, right? Something that's happening in the unfolding that happens beyond my deserving it. It just happens. I don't yet have a category for it. Worlds itself because of anything that I did. And I'm a recipient of something of that. So I have two experiences that are probably pre-thematic in a certain way, but it's a different kind of pre-thematic experience than that pre-thematic of the instinctive level, right? And that those elicit a simultaneous consciousness of the interplay between what we later distinguish between transcendence and other and immanence. But the two is part of one constant continuum. And there is, I think, a primary awareness of this at these radical moments of what we would later call oneness or kind of unity or integrality, right? And we haven't yet. So then the question becomes, how do you move from that where it's not just a psychological experience, it's not just an aesthetic experience, it's a characterization of things, but that there can be a translation of that into theology. That is to say that primariness, which already immediately has an experiential hermeneutic, can be lived. Right? And that's part of what's happening to Job. Right? How do you live with that new consciousness, and not just as a solitary person, but as a person who has to go back into the world? Right? That it's not separate. Right? So there is, and I'm going to elaborate this in the last weeks, but there is already a more primary do and not do that emerges for the self immediately. That's not yet the commandments, thou shalt do this and you shall not do that. But it becomes a primary yes, or you shall sustain this awareness, and you can't harm. The negative is you don't harm the world. There is have to be fully translated into a revealed theology at Sinai or anywhere else into practical laws. But if that's already a divine voice, it's saying, yes, you shall be aware of this, and no, you can't harm these other things. Right? So there's a primary ta'aseh, you have to do this, and there's a primary lo ta'aseh. That's emerging from the experience of the world. So at this point, let me just stop at one more point, because I want to be very clear about something, because there's already, as you see, an implied theology of divine voice. And it was for this reason that I began the class by reading that section from Psalm 29 and the midrash of that. So you remember that the first level is the call or the voice of God is in power. Right? Kol Hashem bakoach. It's in power. So at this first primary level, it's the primary experience that there's something to order of the world that's impacting us at every single level. Right? That can be at the instinctive level that we were talking about. And that voice says yes about certain things and no about certain things, depending on whether you need food, or you need love, or you need to build a home, or you need to kill an animal to eat, or whatever. But that's still at that first level. And you hear there is, at that level of consciousness, there's a hearing of this, of something more than simply the signs of the world. They're taking on significance. Right? So I'm trying to suggest that the movement from sign to signification already takes place at this primary level of instinctive responses. It's already a hermeneutic level of yes and no. I'll do this and I won't do that. This will benefit me, or this will benefit a person I love. Right? I'll do this or I'll do this for for the sake of the power that's producing the plants, if I knew what it was that I needed to do, right? So the moment that I have this awareness that power, koach, is making demands upon me from the outside, I have the sense of a voice of an instruction, right? In our language, I have a sense of instruction or a demand that's being placed on me. It may not yet be at the level of Psalm 29, where it's the voice of God is in power, right? But in a sense, it is the voice of God that's only heard as an imperative to do this, or an imperative to do that, because that's only at the level of reflective consciousness that you've been able to get to at that point, right? I'm talking about this larger spectrum of the human species, but something that we all do even at pre-reflective levels when we're acting that way, right? The level of koach that we saw at a later point in the midrashic discussion was that koach becomes the possibility or the potential for understanding things, right? That phrase from the Mechilta or the rabbinic text that said, the voice of God is in koach, according to the koach or the ability that each person has, right? So at that level, people are producing out of that voice a deeper hermeneutic of this, that the signs of existence take on signification, right? And they become spiritually codified, or they become normatively codified in terms of doing this and not doing that at the most raw level of social normativity, right? Not just a level of eating, but a level. So in other words, the issue of yes and no for survival becomes subtly transformed way before Sinai into this notion of limit versus not transgression, but limit or expansion, right? There's limit, I can't, and it doesn't necessarily have to, I limit my action, clobber you in the head. It may not have a very high ethical reason, but I limit my behavior. I may limit my behavior towards animals or the ground that I see because I want to have that to grow for the next year. But the intuitive thing becomes translated into the categories of what we call limit and growth, or limit and expanse. Well, those things that would enhance life, they both, the expanse would enhance life, limit would also enhance life. They're all related to that position of wanting to create a sustainable order in existence. But the yes and the no, the do and the not, you shall do this and you shall do that, is now reformulated still at this level of social, cultural, let's say philosophical norms, in terms of the upflowing of those kinds of issues that you should do and you shouldn't do, right? And they're perceived to come through the natural order, or through the mystery that's speaking through the natural order, right? In other words, insofar as a person has an intuition that something of the natural order on me, carefully, I'll be in the proper rhythm with it, I'm somehow attributing to the significance of that natural order some kind of primary revelatory instruction, right? That you should do this and you shouldn't do that, right? It may still be very much, it may be still very self-centered and organized, right? You may not have got to this level of what we would call any supererogatory or any behavior that takes you out of your own self-interest. It takes a long while to to be groupish as opposed to non-groupish. They now talk about this in terms of cognitive psychology, that people are naturally groupish, okay? As opposed, so this notion of in-group morality and out-group morality. Even people with higher so-called levels of moral consciousness have in-group morality and out-group morality. I've seen it. You see it all the time, right? But what I'm trying to first get at is that already at these levels of philosophical reflection, where I'm trying to a philosophical transcendence, that is to say, I get out of myself to see things around me in terms of certain kind of categories of workability, I'm already hearing some communication at whatever level I interpret it. Theology was going to try to put it into different kind of categories. But that kind of a person is already hearing an instruction, right? Right? It's not just something coming from the autonomous self, right? Right? You don't go over the cliff because you're going to fall down, right? There's something about the created world or the ordered world that I both have an instinctive faith about, and then I realize that if I pay attention to the imperatives in the communication of that instinctive animal faith world, that world is a sustainable, livable place, right? And my notion of faith or trust, or what it means to be in creation, is already transformed. But notice also one further thing. So you already see that there's a kind of coalescence between what we call the theological, because it's a breakthrough into a certain level, another level of awareness. But, and I think this is important because we forget it, that the primary level of faith and trust is the awareness that you're in this mystery of creation, right? That was that level where you move from this animal faith of sustainability to this level of reverence and the sense of chesed, or the givenness of things that I don't deserve, that just that are there for me already. They're already there for me already. And then I have to recognize my responsibility, maybe for my own self-interest, but I have to already recognize that as soon as I become aware that something is speaking or addressing me, and it's through that, namely, what some people say, that's the natural law. It's telling me that I have to take care of the plants. It's telling me I have to do this. I'm already having a revelation occurs within the primary category of creation. Creation is always first. Revelation doesn't come first, at least according to this way of seeing it. The sense of a sustainable world and a world of creation, of mystery and bounty, that I am humbly embedded in, it begins coming out of that order. I don't necessarily have to have the notion of creation, right? It's just the there-ness of what's there as the world that I find myself in. I may not even have a clear notion of creation, but I have a notion of the world of things, right? But the very notion that I perceive some law or some communication or some instruction that's coming from outside me from the very beginning, that says, if you want to continue living, you'll do this or you won't do that, right? You won't steal, you won't appropriate other people's property, you won't appropriate their bodies, right? You leave things for others, you'll do things. All these do's and don'ts are not yet at the level of a formal system of law and commandments, but they're at the level of the voice of God as koach, in the sense of the voice of God as giving you options and alternatives. You're already hearing some voice that's communicating, that's not quite nature itself, but it's something that's communicating from within that is the voice of signification. And that it's not, we have just projecting that if I'm attentive to the world, I'm attentive to something that of that natural order that's saying to me how I want to relate to it. And then that third level, and then we'll stop for a second here, at that third level where I try to integrate caesura, right, which is that issue of yira or reverence and the givenness of things, those are massive do's and not do's, right? That we'll have to talk about later, about a massive communication of the implication of divine height and human finitude, the implication of being aware that you're born into a world where the grass is growing, it was always there, right? Right? It was tohu, but it's not tohu anymore. It's not chaos. It's already plants and seeds, right? So that becomes another level of consciousness that is still trying to deal with that. So then the moment where we go towards theology and sacred attunement is how does that become a religious, how does that become a communal path? How can that be lived on an ongoing basis, right? And of course, for us as moderns, it's not simply that we take over thoughtlessly the teachings of the past, but we have to renegotiate them. So let me just give one transitional feature, and then I want to open up for questions. So if this sequence that I'm describing is somewhat accurate and truthful, what we have, let us say, in Scripture is the accumulation since Adam of patterns and norms of living that are passed down through the generations, types of hopes, types of confidence, types of way of dealing with certain even the narratives in Genesis, which are before Sinai, they're giving us living a world of how to live. It's a very old explanation, but that's in fact what's happening, right? There are ways that is coming down. From that point, and it's constantly being reinterpreted. From this point of view, and of course it's in the context of the ancient Near East, it's in the context of the world that they're living in, right? So naturally part of the formulation would take place within the language of its time. From this point of view, and it's not a traditional point of view, but at least for me, is a livable point of view. So when the rabbis speak of Moses as Moses our teacher, he becomes the voice of all the voices that intuits in a special way the various norms that have been coming down through a whole series of theological intuitions and experiences. And in a particular revelatory moment, those are formulated now as a clearly prescribed system of you shall do and you shall not do. Right? Now from the intuition or group intuition to another level of rationality that transcend the small group. They become national, right? They're not just an individual's experience or family experience. The movement from individuals to families is taking place up to Sinai. Then the question is, what is the order of that reformulation of you will do this and you won't do that? Of limit and transgression. That will keep the world together, becomes a revelatory moment at Sinai that's formulated. And the fact that, so that's already a hermeneutical move of Moses' deeper understanding of what the voice of God is, that it's another level of perception of bringing together these things at another level of culturally sustained intuitions. And then the laws become explications of that. And then if you go through even through Scripture, you see there's an ongoing hermeneutic of that, of the oral tradition. So if you want to have some sense of that in ancient Israel, I would encourage you to take a look at my book, Biblical Interpretation in Ancient Israel. And then you can see how the whole process of hermeneutical is all ancient Israel. So in other words, Judaism is or Christianity will continue that process. That process is continuing through every single reinterpretation and recodification of the laws. Every reteaching of that, even by Moses in his own voice in Deuteronomy. By the constant readjustment of that, and then again with Ezra and all the reinterpretation. A lot of that is all in my book at the level of inner biblical interpretation. But what it's saying is that even from an inner biblical point of view, these intuitions then have to constantly be recalibrated back into an ongoing hermeneutic. Now let me add one more thing and then we'll have a discussion. Hopefully this will clarify. So we're already seeing that there's an oral tradition before there's a written tradition, right? Of interpreting God's voice at numerous different levels. The written tradition becomes a level of integrating at different levels of normative significance, what we call the revelation, which now sets a new matrix to go forward, right? But that matrix has to constantly deal with ongoing circumstances, which is the ongoing oral tradition, right? Which is then constantly going to expand or contract, pluses or minus, you shall do or shall not do, in relationship to that primary language matrix. So it becomes canonical matrix, but that doesn't mean that its meaning is fixed, right? Once you're in a culture then that is talking about an oral tradition that becomes a written tradition, and a written tradition that becomes an oral tradition, right? In an ongoing way, you then, it seems to me, theologically need a further category that helps you understand that in meta terms. That's why, those of you who read that point, I use the term Torah Klula. So the Torah Klula is this vast, interpenetrating reality of existence. Yet, oral tradition has become written tradition. It's simply some form of the koach of God, of the power of God's vast creativity before it's been transformed into a human hermeneutic. Moses is a master, first master of human spiritual hermeneutic. And he's done so on the basis of a whole series of millennia of interpreting what that voice of God in power is. And then it becomes the voice of God through interpretation and the voice of God expanding. So that Torah Klula, I use the term Torah Klula, that it's the interpenetrating Torah, because you want to have a term that at least puts this pre-hermeneutic structure along the framework of a potential interpretive structure, right? So the language of Torah Klula as the pre-thematic totality of possibilities that can be hermeneutically appropriated, right, through the world, the sense of recursiveness of appropriation, but now in the most primary sense, before the appropriation at the level of exegesis, but simply world exegesis of what does the call of God in power mean? Building. The use of the term Torah is using an ontological term, but as some of the latter-day mystics would say, from our point of view. Right? From God's point of view, it's not necessarily a Torah. Right? But that language is a category, a theological category, so it's already from our point of view. But it's pointing to the sense of the voice of God in power in terms of a pre-hermeneutical reality of the conditions of all possibility. And hermeneutics is only one stage of the transformation of the conditions of possibility of understanding that the culture begins through the hermeneutic of understanding what the voice of God is as they're responding to something outside the self. That the self is engaged, right? It's not like there's a self that projects or an otherness that imposes. The hermeneutics means that the two are relationally entwined, right? And the self is responsible. And what it means, so you have to understand the transformation of these absolute commands. All that I think God, as it were, is saying is do and do not do. All these other things are at a human hermeneutical level. I mean, what would it mean to say that God speaks? Right? I'm speaking now from my own point of view, not speaking for the sake of any particular tradition, but that the voice of God that's speaking through creation as a general revelation to all of creation can only be heard by the human as do this and not do that. And then it has to be interpreted. What more comes through the natural order? That is the primordial divine imperative as perceived by human beings. Unless you have some kind of literalist notion that God pours words into your ear in some way. Remains God before the hermeneutical process. And God has to be God before the world and hermeneutical process. Then how far back do you go to what a God could say, or that we would understand? That would not be, from my point of view, an idolatrous or a commitment that I couldn't ascribe to from the point of view of ultimate faith, right? So that process of interpretation has been going on primordially. That's why it was taking us through all of these various stages. Sinai is you shall do and not do, but now over a long period of reinterpretation through the revelation to Moses as we understand it, or through his intuition, of giving that primary organizing hermeneutic for the people. But that becomes non-negotiable for Jews and Christians. It has to then be expanded. So that becomes a new matrix and touchstone. Same way it was an original matrix, it continues to be one, but the hermeneutical theology means that you've always been doing it, even before you were a theologian, right? You've been doing it from that level of that animal faith and instinctive response up through these various levels, and what we speak of as the normativity of a religious culture is giving this hermeneutical formulation, right? And it's already the trust that someone called Moses. Now, when the people say we will do and we will hear, we have from the point of view of a particular culture a statement, we accept this as a beginning matrix point that we find to be true because Moses the teacher is mediating a whole series of things that they already know at some level. They wouldn't understand it. Not to steal, not to idol. All these things they have to understand at some level. But it's now being formulated at a new level. Right? And they accept that as the new base point. And then all the succeeding points. So it becomes that first massive integration by a teacher, and everybody says, we accept this, right? And continues through a hermeneutical, if there's courage, through a hermeneutical curve that tries to remain faithful to those categories that are saying you should do this and you shouldn't do that. And then we'd have to see from a theological point of view how far you go. And I'll just say one more thing, and then I want to open up for some discussion of questions that you'd have. I think that from this point of view, if there are three issues that emerge from the Ten Commandments, so-called, that are related to this intuition that we're talking about, that we'd want to build on from a general theological point of view, it's three, right? One, the God that's speaking, the norms, took you out of the land of Egypt, means that you're not enslaved to natural process, but there's a freedom that's now being given of a theological responsibility. Right? Right? From the first commandment is the radical fact of human spiritual freedom and not being enslaved to other gods. Right? That you would make or that you would, right? So there's a whole new radical freedom that is implied by that. Right? The section that, whether these are two commandments or is part of the same commandment, you have no other gods before me, means that the freedom from the enslavement of mind and nature has a theological task. Right? Not to turn anything else in place of that spiritual freedom that is that moment of liberation. Okay? So that's putting in a mosaic language of what the ultimate motivation is. Right? And if there's any overarching second commandment, it's the commandment of not to transgress limits. Right? Now, this of the divine and the commandment not to transgress limits. Those are related to the two primary do and do not do. Okay? Not to transgress limits means, right, the property of a person, the body of a person, the nature of the world, or limits of what we might call theological piety In other words, some kind of hubris to take a name in vain, is to just speak frivolously. It's the beginning of the religious task to create a community that's theologically responsible, and that is built through limit. Now that limit can take place through other kind of language too. One kind of limit would be to respect parents. Right? There's a limit of understanding of natural generativity, right? And then there's also a limit of understanding that the world is not your world, so that might be the Sabbath, right? But I think if there are if we're talking about even within the you shall do and you shall not do, if there is a deeper structure that's a cultural hermeneutic of do and not do, merge these primary plus minus things that we saw from the very, very beginning, which is to say, what you shall do is to turn the world into a divine world. That's the radical monotheistic world, and not a world that has minor divine powers, and understand human limit, right? So there's their intention, right? One is an expansive freedom of what it means to take responsibility for living in a world in which you're not enslaved, or you've been freed in a certain, there's a freedom of consciousness and a limitation in terms of behavior. So religion, the biblical religion, or Judaism, people can speak more accurately about Christianity, can't proceed without those two poles, right? Expanding through freedom the kingdom of the divine, and the limitation and limit, right? And the two are brought together. Limit by itself is demonic and demonic. Between the two forms, they have religious terms as well. But that's the balance. That's a primary balance that is at the deepest structure of this of the divine voice, right? At least from the point of view that I'm saying. So we have a half hour. Let's stop now, and maybe we'll still get Logan to read his thing over. But I wanted to at least have you respond to what I'm saying, and also whether there are any terms in that opening first part of Sacred Attunement that need clarity. So let's first, and then Steve.
Do you want to start with the book or just?
No. Wherever you want to come in.
I have three questions. I think they are more or less in sequence with your presentation. The one is about the way you started with this kind of terminology of the very basic experience of the world. And I was wondering if you think that the switch from the pre-thematic to the, say, philosophical attitude or reflective attitude is the same when you have a very basic encounter with things. Say, I'm writing with my pen and the pen stops working, and I start thinking about the very issue of writing kind of in a Sartre Heideggerian way. And if that kind of switch to is in a continuity or progression to those other moments or events that are more like disruptive, like radical situations that also make me switch from the pre-thematic to the reflective attitude. But I just wonder...
You're absolutely right, and I want to come back to this. I think one of the insights, or at least the maturation from the initial writing of Sacred Attunement to where I would want to go is, I think I spoke of rupture in two radical terms in Sacred Attunement. Not that I would take anything away from those, but I would want to begin to say that almost any encounter with another person or thing, or not just when the pen stops working, but every one of these moments should then create that pause, if not a rupture. So I want to come back to this. I think I've learned to thematize it better. whether it's still the same. It's not quite the same thing, but it's not as absolute and radical. But I would want to find a way to bring that into religious consciousness on an ongoing way. Not that it, right? Yeah. Go on.
And a second question. You mentioned Wayne Proudfoot last week.
Yeah, right.
And that book, to me, is very interesting, precisely to talk about hermeneutics and phenomenology, because his take about Schleiermacher and William James is that, let me perhaps rephrase something, go back to Proudfoot. If one moves from the very basic example of the pen, or many other things, right, to the issue of, rupture, something radical, or in your comment, perhaps more progressive. But I guess my question is how we identify something that we may or may not want to call distinctively religious or distinctively theological, right? Because when I think about these moments, I had in the back of my mind Heidegger, where he speaks about the fundamental question of metaphysics, that somehow is brought up by moments of radical boredom or radical joy or fear or death, right? These kind of situations that kind of prompt the question, right? But then you can go and just ask the question of what are things there instead of not being there, which is a question that can be philosophical, certainly a question about the meaning of things, but doesn't have to be a religious question. It doesn't have to be a question about this other voice you were talking about. And let me go back to Proudfoot then. Because what Proudfoot argues against Schleiermacher and against James is that they kind of assume these limits that we encounter in the world are somehow showing the infinite, or what James calls the more. And what Proudfoot argues, I think convincingly, at least in certain ways, like, well, this is already a hermeneutics of that thing, like the infinite, the more. So we're shaping our interpretation of the world through these categories, even in these very initial stages of reflection, which leads me to one of the, I think you put it so nicely by the end, the question of is there a God, how do you say it, before the hermeneutical process? And I think the question is key. So can we talk about God? Can we talk about something distinctively religious, going back to this phenomenology of experience and this limit and this sense of transcendence, without this kind of shaping that already as religious, making that part of our language as something that is transcendent, something that's religious, instead of just a given that doesn't have to be interpreted as a God, as Yahweh's voice, or something along those lines. And to me, this is a pressing question, is, I guess, mine, but I don't know what are your thoughts on that, because to me it's like, I get all the transition, the phenomenological transition. I'm with you in regards of there is an obvious givenness, there is an obvious question, because moving us to a question about the theological, a question about God, and is that something that we somehow can indeed assume before the hermeneutical process?
Obviously, it's the core issue, right? The question is, how can you answer that question without falling back into ontological assertions about being, which is on this side of the equation, right? Right? That's obviously, I don't want to get into the issue of ontotheology, but the issue is, can we speak in any kind of faith or response? It's not faith in things unseen, but is there any way that we can talk about this religiously when we know that we've come to a certain limit, right? And that we can't talk about God as some kind of an ontological being in this sense, because we've reached the limit that we're speaking from within being, so how could you get out of being and say anything about God, right? I want to leave aside for now the issue of negative theology and what it's, because that's one path, right? And I want to at least stay within the positive side at this point, right? So that's why I was trying to point from the level of breakthrough moments that don't have the cognitive constructions. So the difference between what I was trying to suggest about the caesura, and that's different from Schleiermacher and your very accurate restatement of Proudhood's position, is whether there can be some moment that we would call religious awareness that doesn't have, that's a boundary consciousness that is simultaneously aware of hitting the boundary, and that there is an intuition that there's a conditionality, and we can't talk about. In other words, that moment as event is not already a theological experience, but it takes us to the boundary of a breakthrough. That's why one of the ways it can only be talked about as light, right? In other words, there becomes this sense. That's why religions would say when you come to that boundary point, that's why light is such an important metaphor, because what light means is that light is refracted, and it's refracted through material and other kinds of shapes. But the fullness of light as an imaginative theological category is what is something of that so-called fullness before the refractions or the limitation into vessels, into contractions, however religious language you want to use, but that the world somehow is a refraction. So light can become, as you try to take yourself to a boundary language that's still language, that hovers on the boundary. You can't be other than that, but that you don't cross over to make an ontological assertion. Your awareness. So certain unique individuals have gotten to that boundary consciousness, and they've preserved that in that for the tradition. In other words, they've indicated that they dare to say that the more is a fullness of light, the more is a fullness of will, the more is the condition of all possibilities, whatever that means, right? We have no idea what that means, right? Or that the condition of all possibilities is the fullness of all actualities, right? I mean, because that level of, that's why paradox works at that boundary point, because it's trying to simultaneously say and unsay at the same time. That's why that boundary point for mystical consciousness is so vital, because we have an intuition of a boundary. It's liminal, right? And we then get thrown back. Or you have, I'll give you one more radical example, because they always fall back in terms of a hermeneutical structure. So I think one of the most interesting of them is the most astonishing reinterpretation of the opening line of Genesis that appears. So the opening line of Genesis, so just think about what the hermeneutical revolution of this statement is that's answering your question, right? So the opening line of Genesis is Bereshit, at the beginning, bara, created, Elohim, right? God created. At the beginning, God created. Now, just think about what is the spiritual consciousness that interpreted that to say the following, right? With the concept of beginning, X created Elohim, which is a legitimate hermeneutical reading, namely wisdom, or with the in other words, the way the the way the masters of the Zohar would say it is, with the concept of beginning, wisdom, which is the ultimate category of mind, created the notion of God. God is already a cultural category, right? Now, we're not talking about the God beyond God, because this would be, let us say, the Ein Sof or the infinite, but that too is a category. So the question I want you of what is the boundary consciousness that takes you to a point that then you create a hermeneutical theology that could say that. It's not saying with Eckhart a God beyond God, because that simply pushes the ontological issue one more step down the bowling alley, right? So the question then would be, with Reshit, which is to say with the concept of beginning, because you have to begin with beginning. There has to be some notion of origin, with the conceptuality that there is being, wisdom, which is mind in human form, or ontological hypostasis, wisdom, created Elohim, created God. Without saying, because we filled in that wisdom has done that. It's kept silence in the text, right? So you say, with the notion of beginning, which is as far back as we can go conceptually, blank, because we can't say it, has created Elohim. So it becomes a category, and that's biblical theology, but it's biblical theology on steroids, right? Right? Because it's a hermeneutical theology, it's a biblical theology, but it has nothing whatever to do with creatio ex nihilo in any sense that later theology would even begin to understand. So I'm just saying, here you have a hermeneutical theology that's taken you to that limit of consciousness which keeps the blank and makes you aware that, and has never said there's a God beyond God, because something mysterious has created Godhood. I know. So you see that we're caught between the sacred and the profane, right? That's the point that religion will keep recapitulating. The sacred being the utterly unsayable, and the profane is also a theological stance, because it's within the world of cognitive normativity. So how do you, obviously can't preach this on Saturday or Sunday, right? So the philosophers and the mystics were right. You have to be careful who you say this to and when. You have to acquire the right to do this, and then you speak it in whispers, right? You can't have a normal congregation have this theology. Then you have to find another level that speaks the truth of that, but that doesn't abrogate that intuition, right?
Just a very quick one. Would you be comfortable saying something like this? So the phenomenological experience takes you to certain places, right? And then you get to the place of the ultimate, where these massive questions about the meaning of everything are there for you. And then you need to make choices. This
Right.
sounds very simple somehow, but I don't know if so.
Right.
And then when you make choices, you can basically, it's actually kind of a Jamesian sort of wager. Like, you either go for the transcendent option of Yahweh or whatever other form to call God we want to pick, or you just go for something different. But there is no way, to put it in these terms, to ask the question of what's
it's thematized, but it's not it can't be a substantive question.
Mhm.
you can only thematize it as a form of awareness, or else you've fallen back into what you thought you were transcending.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of keeping both. Yeah.
Two sort of related questions in the nature of a pushback, I guess. You mentioned earlier avoiding idolatrous ways of talking about God. And this is a move that I've seen in various Maimonides and Tillich, of taking a kind of austere philosophical interpretation of what idolatry means. Austere?
No, what do you mean by that?
Like idolatry as attributing to treating things as ultimate which are not ultimate.
What is the word that you use?
Austere, like the way you might describe a room that was very
Austere. Austere.
Yes.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Oh, no. I'm speaking American. Okay.
Sorry. But it seems to me that I don't know, command to avoid. It seems to me that something has gone not wrong necessarily, but very strangely when this inner biblical category is used to sort of undermine some of the most basic theological grammar that the tradition presents.
What's undermined by what I said?
Like that God is someone who presents concrete demands to particular groups or individuals.
Okay, so you take your stand that God, there has to be a type of human content to the divine voice.
Something like that, yeah.
Okay,
More
you're not alone with that. Okay,
yeah, of a sort of neo-orthodox kind of.
Okay, I think I want to come back to that. I don't want to avoid that. I can't. Okay, so I have to find a contemporary theology of how the divine voice speaks to humans. Right? It's both and. Right? I've been speaking of a both and.
Both what?
Of a both and. Right? So I obviously you're speaking from your point of view, but it's a bit of a statement. But that is on the assumption that it's all God and not human. As if it was any human component in that, it wouldn't have a divine component.
I wouldn't be willing to put it in terms that strong.
Okay.
But
I think that's a point that we have to come back to that. That is a very traditional pushback. What did God really say? And right? And
or is God?
So I think part of the issue that we have to face is how do we understand the normativity of that language that then appears in Scripture that may come through the way I've talked about it. What gives it normative, canonical, or theological authority?
That's basically my second question, which is that the way you describe halakha as the gesture of the generations, here seems to recall Kaplan very strongly to me, this notion of mitzvot as the folkways of the Jewish people, this sort of inherited.
But for me, it's response to the divine imperative. It's not just sociological things. I think next week what I want to do is cultural second half of Sacred Atonement. We will come back to these more strongly, but I'm on the other side of the universe of Mordechai Kaplan, not in the sense that these are only they've been reduced to sociological categories, the things that people do, and then they project a kind of Durkheimian theological significance, and they keep the people together. When I speak about the gesture of the generations, it's more that it's through people's embodied response to God through mind and body that is passed on, that people continue some forms of authenticity that have been reflected through gesture, through living mental response, that's also a gesture, and things like that. So it's a very concrete notion of ongoing embodiment that's being passed on. And that, for example, how do the generations activate and live out the abstract commandments as bodily gestures? That's a fundamental question of rabbinic interpretation. Otherwise, they're just words. How come the gestures? Right? How do you turn those statements in the book of Exodus, or Leviticus, Deuteronomy, into action? It's just words. Right? So that becomes part of the gesture of the generations. If you watch your elders do it, or you watch people teach you how to do it, or they explain it, how would you know how to do that? Right? So I think we have to talk about, that's part of what I mean by that. It's turning the written text into an active life.
I'm wondering, when you talk about the gesture of the generations, is it in the same sense that symbolism and myth and recur are given life through Scripture, in the same sense? I mean, though reading the same sources, working through this in very similar ways.
I mean, that's part of what I want to come to when we talk about the different levels of pardes, of the different levels. There are some levels where it is symbolic, and there are other levels where it's not symbolic.
But it goes beyond.
But I want to have it always.
Right, but it goes beyond symbol. And I think if you would push Recur a little bit further, he will reach that, because he situates it in a very particular.
Then would want you to remind me about next time is not so much that these are symbols, but I would see it in the framework of Neo-Kantian or Kasira symbolic forms. These become forms of expressibility of how to actualize certain types of limit or expansion for the sake of living out the covenant. Every single, each one is a symbolic form of a certain kind of expression, of giving expression to doing this in this way, as the fullest elaboration of living a covenantal life, which then has to be qualified or expanded in all the time, right? But that raises the fear of a slippery slope, the same way they need to say, well, God said this, so that... but I think what we can't forget, and I want to come back to as a separate topic, you can't... the medievals understood it quite well, Sadhya Gaon. You can't forget the authority. The authority of the sacred community that lives out the tradition is fundamental. And you make commitments to the authority of specific sacred communities and their way of practice. So that's part of normativity. But there, there's also obviously divine normativity too, and I'm not dodging that. But don't ever forget, from the very first moment, the people say, we shall do and we shall hear. There's a spiritual normativity of the people that transforms words that didn't have to have any theological significance into words that have theological significance. Right? Or the very fact that in the book of Isaiah it says, you are my witnesses, says the Lord. And the Midrash in Sifrei and Deuteronomy says, if you're not my witnesses, I'm not the Lord. Now, if I don't have people who embody or respond to that, you can't talk about God. How could you even talk God language if you don't have people who are embodying this in a community? So again, the weight is on the hermeneutical responsibility of the community to witness and act. Right? It doesn't mean that every piece of that is true or at the same level. I'm not speaking fundamentalistically, right? But I think there's a lot of factors, and we don't want to kind of just isolate one or two, which have been tendencies from antiquity to the modernity, which serve certain as speed bumps to slow down this hermeneutical process, right? But I think we're trying to construct what is workable, what would be workable for a modern Jew, and what would be workable for a modern Christian who's faced with similar but not the same kinds of issues, right? For whom there is some larger notion of what logos would mean, right? So I want to hear what, people to come in on those issues, but so part of what I'm speaking for is I'm only responsible for what I'm speaking for. I'm not speaking in any kind of traditional form that could be endorsed by any rabbinic authority, my interest or concern. Right? So the issue from that point of view is, can I speak this way and stay within a creative expansion of the tradition? Right? So some people would say the other side of what you're not saying. You talk this way, you're out of the game. Right? Okay. I'm out of your game, and I won't get Mafter Yonah. That's fine. I can live with that. Yeah.
Two things. Number one, you have made a big point in Sacred Attunement of we do and we hear.
Yeah.
This strikes me the order's reversed. Why don't we hear and then we do?
Okay, so that's a famous, what's called in the Greek, the hysteron proteron. That the second comes first, right? So the tradition has understood that, let's say, at the present time, let's just say, traditions understand that in two ways. We'll do until we understand, right? In other words, that's a faith commitment. The faith commitment is we'll do until we understand. That's what you tell a child. And then the other side, which is the more Rosenzweigian perspective, that you only know by doing. There is understanding. Because it's not simply an abstract conceptual issue. The very doing is a form of knowing of what it means. It's not an abstract knowing, it's a knowing that comes through a particular form of doing. So maybe that is a good point for us to stop. I want to get some responses next week. I think I do want to begin with Logan's, I think, because he had a very brief but very pointed issue about issues of hearing and issues comparing that with Gadamer. I want us to kind of think through the fourfold method of interpretation, where you might have queries and questions of what I was trying to do there, Sacred Attunement, because what we want to do in a few more weeks is quite different, right? So the question is, how does this theology become livable and sustainable insofar as it's spoken about in Sacred Attunement, and then certain other aspects in the last part where it brings it into kind of study or community, kind of smaller topics, but continue that same consciousness, not other kinds of. And the reason I chose study as fundamental, but it also gets to the level of observance, is because those are the fundamental Jewish ways of staying in contact with God, through study and interpretation and through practice, right? So then the question for a Christian would be, how could that, some similar implications between, let us say, a cosmic Christ and a and earthly, Jesus be understood so that following a certain path would keep one in contact with what radically transcends the particular incarnation, and it talks about the incarnation of being itself. Right? And there would be different ways, I think, that Christians would want to talk about that, and I would want to hear how you would do that so that we can learn from each other about that. Or I need to hear if something Jewish just doesn't make sense factually or doesn't make sense theologically. Like how can you talk that way? I need to hear. So don't be maybe one. Did you want to? Yeah. Maxim has one final comment.
It's a question.
Is that a question? Okay.
Does theology work for a person in a concentration camp, for a person with cancer, for a job in chapter 3 who doesn't know that there will be chapters 38 and maybe there will be no chapter 38? That's the question.
So I can't answer that. I couldn't answer it at all, but I think Maxim's statement, how does this work for a person in a concentration camp, in extremis, in Job 3, I think that's the reason why I said that it has to work in the framework of evil. I think I have a way of trying to talk about that. And let me try to address it more fully next time. But I would simply have to say, I don't know how I would respond.
I have had this question since 2008.
All right, so I don't know how I'd respond. I would hope, this is the only way I could answer at this point. I would hope that my theological study would not allow me to be an animal. That's all I can say. Because I don't know how I would respond to insane persecution. I have no idea what would happen to me psychologically. So it would be stupid for me to even think that I could imagine another person, let alone how I would respond, right? All I can say is that if theology has any value, it's a kind of cultivation of readiness to face situations. Ultimately, that's all it is. It's a cultivation of consciousness. And I would say, all I could say about that horror is the same way that I would respond if I lost my temper at home. That somehow I can be called back to my humanity somehow or faster on the basis of this. So I can't say how it would help you, but we would hope that it would prevent you from being an animal. Or if you begin to move in that direction, you can try to correct value is. So right? That's I think that I don't think I could have any other response. But it's the cultivation for me to deal with all kinds of circumstances that might compromise or that put my self-preservation in absolute risk. Certain piety could simply become martyrs in a very awesome manner, right? But your question is, how could a person deal with that? And I can only say that it's a cultivation of a spiritual depth that if, God forbid, anybody was in a compromised situation, that they could somehow retrieve better values than worse values. More than that, what can we say? We're all in the same mud. All right. See you guys. 2:15, you want to? Yeah, but I'm gonna write it down in my book. Yeah, but I'll do that. It just means when I'll be coming in. I'll just put it in my book, but I should remember, 2:15. If it doesn't work, I'll be in on Wednesday, and then I'm probably gonna be coming in for a defense on Thursday at 12. I need to do before, but I think Tuesday should be fine.
Second critique.
Wait, do I have all the paper? Wait a minute. Paper, did I get papers already? Are they under here?
Is very much.
Oh, yeah, wait a minute. I want to make sure I have. Who gave me a paper and where did I put it?
No, I think you put them in the book.
Did I put it in here already?